So, good afternoon. My name is Frank and I work at Woodcraft in lovely San Carlos, California. And we're here today to talk about amazing clear casts for making resin cheese boards, or river cheese boards, however you want to call them. So, we're going to go through the steps of making one of these, kind of start to finish, and off we go. So, what I did was to start with, I started with a solid piece of any particular wood that you like, and I drew a pattern, a river pattern down the front of it, and then cut it out with a bandsaw. So what I ended up with was this. Okay, notice the edges are sealed. This is super important that this be done with a liquid epoxy. I use Mirror Coat on it. What happens is if you don't seal the wood, it starts to off gas and it causes bubbles in your resin, which are not desirable. Okay, so now that we have our two pieces cut, we need to glue some dams onto the end to contain the epoxy. Before we do that, we need to have a board that has packing tape on it so the epoxy will not stick to it. So what we're going to do is after we glue the dams on, which is right here, we're going to take our pieces, which would now essentially be one piece, and lay it on our substrate that we have put tape in here so we're not going to get stick. And then we're going to clamp the four corners. And I also ran tape around the outside of the substrate just as extra insurance for when I start to pour, because I don't want any epoxy leaking out if I can avoid it. Okay, so this amazing clear cast is measured 1-to-1 by volume. There's other epoxies such as limonite that are measured 1-to-1 by weight. It's really important to read the directions and get your proportions right. I have an example of what can happen when you don't get your proportions right or you don't mix it properly. Speaking of mixing, that is probably the most crucial step besides getting the proportions correct. You need to mix and mix and mix, and then when you think you've mixed enough, you mix some more. This epoxy takes 30 to 40 minutes of open time, so even if you mix for 10 minutes, it's okay. The more you mix, the better your results are going to be. And then as you're mixing, make sure you're scraping down the sides of the cup and the bottom, and occasionally your stick, because you don't want the hardener touching in the wrong place. That's where the white comes in, if there's too much hardener. Okay, so with this size board, we calculated that it's going to take one bottle of each. It'll take a whole box of this stuff to do this one pour. Important that you do that. You always will also want to mix a little more than you think you need. That way, if you get a low spot or whatever, you've got a little bit already mixed in order to backfill it. So let's go ahead and mix. So I determined I'm going to use the whole thing here. So I'm just going to pour this all together.
We are going to continue to mix. And yes, the inside takes a little longer because it's really thick.
Okay, so now we can start mixing. And we just want to go nice and slow because I don't want to incorporate any air into the mix. It's not like we're scrambling eggs. Go nice and easy. And like I said before, make sure you're scraping down the sides of the cup at all times. And your stick from time to time. Now that we've mixed our epoxy for 10 minutes or so, we're going to do our pour. So we're just going to slowly pour this into our recess here. And the trick is again to go slowly because we don't want to develop any bubbles if we can avoid it. And just let it flow down to the end of the mold. And we want to make sure that we get the mold filled all the way to the top. Okay. So, now if you can see right here, we're getting a little bubbling on the edges. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to let it sit for a few minutes. Okay, so now we've mixed our epoxy for about 10 minutes, then we poured it, and I've let it sit for probably 10 minutes or so of its 30-minute working time. And I've noticed that I've gotten some bubbling. So what I want to do is I want to take a heat gun to it and get rid of the bubbles. I also notice I got a sliver in there. So I'm going to take my heat gun, and I don't want it going ripping fast, but I want it hot. So I've got this thing set to about 400 degrees. And then I just want to gently come across the surface, and that will draw out the bubbles. So you want to be careful and not... The reason you want this thing ripping hot is it'll splash the epoxy up out of the mold if you're not careful with it. Which I got a little of that going right now. And it's okay to have some epoxy spill out because you're going to need to run it through the drum sander at some point anyway. So, not the end of the world if you get a little epoxy dripping out of there.
Tape off the clamps.
Huh?
Tape off the clamps.
Yep. And another thing you want to do is tape off your clamps. That way, if you do get some leakage and your clamps get epoxy on them, it won't stick to them. Okay, so now that we poured our epoxy, we let it sit for, I don't know, 10 minutes or so. And I've been touching with the heat gun the entire time. So now I'm pretty happy with the way this looks. I'm not getting a bunch of bubbles and that kind of stuff going on. So I think we're ready to add some color to it. So with these Alumilite colors, you can mix it one of two ways. You can mix the color directly into the epoxy, and you'll end up with a solid, translucent color. Or you can do like what we're going to do today and kind of do a tie-dye effect. The one thing you want to remember with these dyes is that a very little bit goes a long way. Notice I'm just using the tip of a little stick that I made, and I'm just going to scoop up a little bit of color, and I'm going to go into the board. And this is just like baking a cake. You can add more salt, but you can't take it out. And if you go too hard with the color, it tends to turn black. So see how I'm just kind of swirling this in. And it can be a random pattern. It doesn't have to be anything, geometrical or anything like that. You're just adding a little bit of visual interest to it. Okay, I think we're just gonna leave it like that and call that good. So at the end of this, now we wait. This takes between 18 and 24 hours to cure. I tend to wait the full 24 before I start messing around with it. So what I end up with at the end of this, 24 hours later, I end up with that. So what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna go to my table saw and I'm gonna cut off these sacrificial dams on both ends, and then we'll just finish it as we would another cutting board. Awesome. Okay, the last quick note on the bubble prevention. It's best to keep your heat gun out and revisit the board every 10 minutes or so for the first hour. And if you do see latent bubbles that weren't there before, which can happen with this material, just zap them with the heat gun and they will go away. Okay, so now that we've drum sanded our river board, we're gonna polish it out and finish it. There's lots of things you could do with these. You could round the corners, you could ease the edges with the router table or just with the sander. But the main focus today is going to be on getting the plastic polished out and looking good. We did get a couple of voids, which is typical with this material. What I did was I filled them with CA glue, and now we're going to sand them off. All right, so as you can see, the voids have essentially disappeared, and our plastic is now smooth. We would sand this out for about 220, and then, as usual, get the board wet, so we raise the grain, resand to 220. And then the last step that is a little different than a regular cutting board is we're now going to polish the resin so it turns clear again. So what we're going to do is we're going to simply take a piece of cloth, and put it on our sander. Now here's the important part. You need to have dust collection hooked up to your sander, because what that's going to do, the vacuum is going to hold the cloth to your sanding pad. I guess it's not the end of the world if you don't have dust collection, but it makes life much easier. So what we're going to do is we're going to use this stuff called Hut Ultra Gloss. It's a micro mesh, kind of micro bead polishing compound. You could also use automotive rubbing compound. It works well as well. But we have this, so we're going to use it. So we're just going to put a little bit down and then turn on my sander. So after we've sanded to 220, raised the grain, resanded, and polished the epoxy, this is what we end up with. So once you do both sides, if you hold it up to the light, it'll be transparent, totally see-through. Now the last thing we want to do is our food grade finish, which is going to be a choice of a couple of things. You could use butcher block oil, you could use the butcher block conditioner, which is a waxing oil. Simple to put on, you flood it, let it dry, wipe it off, you're done. Cool, well thanks for watching, guys.
There you go.